So yeah, just a little bit more about Snode. Some context for the presentation is we're a cyber defense firm based out of Centurion, and our technology spans across 6 continents and about 5 million devices that we protect, all for governments, for private institutions, etc. And straight into the presentation. So many of you guys may be familiar with Mr. Robot. There's an episode in Mr. Robot where Elliot's in this alternate reality where he's the CEO of a cybersecurity company, and he tells his client, "I've seen you get hacked." And the client then gets a big sudden shock, and he said, "No, you haven't been hacked, but I ran some simulations and I saw you get hacked." And this is what inspired this presentation. Well, not the presentation, but the prototype that we've built using, it's an AI-based prototype that generates simulations, attack modeling, threat modeling, and risk modeling. So typically there's 3 types of simulations. You've got physical simulations, which is probably the most prevalent for a really good reason. It's really high fidelity. And essentially that would mean you hire a hacker attacks you, and you see how your defenses hold up. The second one is like lab emulation simulation. Now, this is something that we typically do at Snode to test our detective capabilities against some form of malware or an exploit, very much exploding it in the lab, and then testing our control effectiveness in the ability to detect it or defend against it. Now, simulation modeling is something that we see a little bit less. It's a data-driven exercise, but it's normally a desktop exercise that needs to be executed by an expert analyst. And really the risk, the risk is in the eye of the beholder. And that's where it kind of falls short. So it's lower fidelity than any of the other 2 models. The challenge we wanted to solve was, 1, can we increase the fidelity so it surpasses a physical simulation? The second part of it is, could we run hundreds and possibly thousands of simulations in real time using AI so that we could increasingly in real time make the client aware of their risk profile, their vulnerability landscape, the threat landscape, and help them prioritize risk. And I'll tell you why that's important in a second. I love Sun Tzu. The Art of War is a great book. You should read it. There's a piece from The Art of War. If you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. Think of the 100 battles as the 100 simulations we're running for you in a second. And the 2 inputs is your threat data, which is knowing your enemy, and your asset vulnerability data and risk profile data, which is knowing yourself. So now, what's the problem? Well, Sun Tzu didn't exist in the digital age with the 4th Industrial Revolution. I took these pictures on Saturday morning at about 3 a.m. And it's a medium-sized business within South Africa in the telecommunication space. And the graph on the left represents all the communications within that second that was happening, or close to a second, maybe even less. The graph on the top right, all the data flows happening externally. And the graph at the bottom, the vulnerabilities. I'm drawing your attention specifically to, like, for example, where it says critical 78 vulnerabilities. Now, when you think about this, it's cognitive overload for a human being. And as much as our platform is, it's a big data platform, which Craig and the previous speakers have referenced. But it's not amplifying the information provided into intelligence, right? Now, if we look at the enemy landscape, it's not much better. Interestingly enough, you've got 78 high-risk assets, highly likely attacks from high-risk sort of criminal entities that are targeting this institution in that very second. Now, don't get me wrong, the solutions are there. So we use defense to solve these problems. But it's really treating the symptom, right? It's not actually helping you solve the root cause. And the thing is, the client looks at these dashboards, and it's great that they're pretty. It's great that they're giving you this data and information in real time, but it doesn't really ask the question of, so what? What's the very next thing I need to walk out of here and do? So that's the question we wanted to go out and answer, right? We wanted to see whether we could elevate this data or this information into true forms of intelligence, right? Actionable intelligence, to be precise. And the high-level methodology is, could we classify attackers' behaviors? Because, an attacker needs to get lucky once. We as defenders need to get lucky all the time. But there's a few conditional items for an attacker to get lucky. So I've got to break into your network. We call that initial access. I've got to escalate my privileges. That means I'm going from a user to an administrator. Then I'm going to move laterally to some critical data asset. We call that lateral movement. And then I'm potentially going to exfiltrate or try and extort you from that point forth. So understanding the threats, understanding the vulnerabilities in context to each other, and understanding the successful attack paths that this threat needs to follow, and then helping you understand what's the next big thing that you need to go out and fix. So the way the platform sits together is there's a correlation system. This is like natural grouping, co-occurrence, and these sort of algorithms that are helping you contextualize all these events that are all happening simultaneously within that second. Then there's a classification system, right? That's telling you, well, these components are really strongly tied to initial access or privilege escalation or lateral movement. Then there's a component which is asset and risk profiling, because you wouldn't go into rob a bank and ask the teller for jewelry the same way you wouldn't go into a jewelry store and ask for the cash in the register. Understanding what's your assets is extremely important. And then there's the generative AI part, where we design attack trees, and I'll show you an example of an attack tree, understand the attack paths and the graphing thereof, and how we can break the actual attack path by putting in some sort of mitigating or control or some form of remediation. And having expert analysts essentially reinforce this. Now, I'm going to give you an example. There's three really important things I want to illustrate in this example. Number one, on the left, you'll see an example of an attack tree. We use graphers, and that was actually AI generated. I do use the terms, I don't like to use AI, ML, cognitive computing and mathematics interchangeably. So I'm using some poetic license just to tie closer to the theme. And this is the same client. Unfortunately, it's not on Saturday night, but it's about a year earlier when we set off to design this prototype. So this entire attack graph is the output, essentially, of the algorithms. What's really impressive here is that although there's, I think there's 8 vulnerabilities that the platform picked up and 5 data assets that were affected, that red point with attack vector 1 and vulnerability 1, if you fix that, you take away the entire problem statement, right? So one action, could break the entire attacker's kill chain. And just in terms of risk, what was most interesting is that database server is actually airtime. The fact that a machine could understand this, contextualize it, for those who are not familiar with the telco industry, at any given time, an airtime database could hold anything from 20 million to 60 million rands worth of airtime. Airtime is money. The pins go disappear. It goes into the black market. It's incredibly hard to trace. The fact that a machine could understand that data that I showed you earlier in real time and isolate one action that you needed to follow up with and isolate a 20 million to 60 million rand risk is an exceptional result. Of course, there were some problems. For example, the predictive analytics did its job. The prescriptive analytics needed some work, right? Came up, it said, the solution's multi-factor authentication. And unfortunately, this is a point-to-point VPN, not a user VPN. With that said, I'd like to thank you for your time. I know I ran out of time there, went really quick. And I'm going to leave you with the Sun Tzu quote. And I'm